What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my first impressions for Drakensang, the River of Time, a prequel to the original Drakensang The Dark Eye, which I reviewed just a couple of months ago. But in reviewing that game, people sung the praises of this prequel follow-up so much that I knew I wanted to get to it relatively quickly, which is naturally what we're doing here, of course. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Drakensang as a whole, it utilizes the Dark Eye TTRPG system that is very popular in Germany, and after playing the original title, which also uses it, of course, I've come to enjoy it a fair bit myself, which is another reason I wanted to get to this one so quickly. And right away, I will say that this game definitely has some improvements over the original, just in the presentation of various elements. Which makes sense as this title released just a couple of years after the first one and utilizes essentially that game's core, it would seem. But realistically, the story for first impressions with this one starts a little bit before you actually start playing the game, with the game's DLC expansion. You see, Drakensang The River of Time received a big DLC update called Felician's Secret, which I may or may not be mispronouncing, I'm not sure. And this DLC is apparently fairly similar to something like Fable 1's The Lost Chapters, in that it adds a whole bunch of content across the game as opposed to just an individual part of it. But another curious thing about this DLC is that it sort of builds on to the base version of the game in terms of how it's installed on your hard drive as well. So I'm using Steam here, of course, and both Drakensang The River of Time and this DLC update are separate library entries. And in fact, installing Felician's Secret seems to install the base game plus this update, though if you want to carry any saves over from the original base game, you've got to have that installed plus the DLC from what I understand. And then from there, you just use the DLC install of the game instead of firing up the base version, which I just thought was a sort of oddity, and realistically the kind of thing you run into with these slightly older games. And the River of Time itself is from 2011 to be specific, which brings me to my second point. Almost identically to the first game, if you're on Windows 10 or 11, this game likely won't run very well for you unless you go set the launch options to force it into windowed mode, which is why this video might look slightly awkward. But outside of that one caveat, it seems to be running perfectly well otherwise. But from there, let's talk about some of the game content and the first impressions, of course. So right away, character creation has seen some useful improvements, but largely works the same way as ever. The expert mode, which allows you to actually customize a preset, is a little easier to use and understand due to the interface updates here, and you also have better control over the actual look of your character, even if it's still a little bit limited. As the original title saw you basically stuck with the generic character model, whereas here you can pick things like hair and face options. But again, it's still a little bit limited, and this is because as you pick one of these classes, your race and culture and background for that class is effectively picked for you at the same time, which means things like elves and dwarves are tied to specific archetypes or classes that only they can use. But overall, that information is presented better here. Now, once we dive into the game, we of course get thrown into the story, and in this case, it looks like we are headed to a town to complete our training, which is actually a unique quest based on the archetype you picked, and the beginning of the game, after a short introductory sequence that sees you attacked by pirates, throws you into this town largely alone to figure out a few different things. But that training part is what I want to focus on first, because I thought that was just such a neat idea that not only do they send your character to this town for a generic reason to get you introduced to the plot, but they actually turn this into 4 distinct training quests that actually go ahead and teach you some skills and things that will be useful to your class in a way that feels very natural because it flows pretty well with the game's default need to go speak to trainers to learn individual skills. But that's why we're sent to this city initially, but the actual plot has more to do with those pirates that attacked us. You see, alongside our ship here, we were also traveling with a group of heroes that if you've played the first game, you should recognize at least a few of, Ardo and Forgrim. Ardo is an NPC that you actually don't meet in the first game, but he summons you to the city of Freedock to start that game's quest before he is murdered off screen before you get there. But as this is a prequel, we get to see a story that he is more directly involved in, and his friend Forgrim, who is a companion in the original game as well, is the one telling us this narrative via a framing device, which I thought was a pretty cool little touch. Assisting these characters, you're going to be investigating what's going on with the pirates, and I imagine that rolls into the rest of the narrative, but that seems to be where it kicks off. But right away, I'll say that I enjoy how they basically throw you into this large map and city area and sort of just let you figure individual things out on your own in a relatively low stakes environment before inundating you with things like companions, etc. But it is my understanding that this game has far less companions than the original as well, and I'm curious if those companions are instead going to come with like a proper integrated quest this time around, because that is not something they really did much of in the original as well, with really only like one or two of the companions getting quests at all. But speaking a little more about this city, I've got to say that it's very noticeable that they've expanded the size of the maps that you have access to, as the city in the first game as well was divided up into like 3 little sub-maps, where this one seems to be all one thing plus a surrounding wooded area outside. So just the areas I've been exploring thus far have already been a fair bit more impressive, on top of their attempt to do things like camera work for individual cutscenes. All in all, I would say first impressions have been pretty good. I think even the little side quests that I've been up to and the training quest line as well have been interesting additions, especially because, as much as I enjoyed the first game, its narrative was a little bit hard to follow at times, whereas this one seems to be building to something a little more realized and thought out at the very least. So hopefully that will continue, but just from a gameplay standpoint, it seems like they made a fair few improvements from that first title, and I'm looking forward to seeing if they've got the content to really back up that. But given how everyone seems to enjoy this one compared to that original title, things are looking hopefully pretty optimistic on that side of things. Now, in terms of a timeline for the review, I'm not exactly sure. It's my understanding that this is not an insanely long game or anything. I think most of the estimates I've seen for this one put it at about 30 or 40 hours, so hopefully I'll have this knocked out in just a few days. But ultimately, we shall see, because right now I'm just looking forward to diving into some of the content I've seen about this game and some of the later areas that look really fantastic, alongside the DLC area specifically, which I hear is really well done at the same time. So a lot to look forward to with this one. I'm hoping it manages to live up to the hype, because I really came to enjoy the system with my look at the first game, but only time will tell, which is where I'm going to wrap up this particular video. So I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you're looking forward to the upcoming review, do remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, as I cover a ton of CRPGs, even old classics like this one. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.